little bit about the interview that you did this week with Adam Levick.
Right. So we brought in Adam. Adam works with one of Camera's affiliates. If you all might remember, we had the director of the U.S. Camera office on a couple weeks ago, and
explain what Camera is.
So Camera is an organization. So it's an NGO, also a non-governmental organization.
Right, we got to say
that monitors the media for anti-Semitism, inaccurate reporting as it concerns Israel, and works with the media in doing the corrections. Adam works out of the UK bureau, and he, in particular, I guess I forget the name of the bureau. It's on the interview. UK Watch. I'm sorry if you want to look it up. It's the UK Watch, but it's an affiliated Camera. But we talked with him about some of the issues, in particular what came out this week, some of the media and the reporting about the conflict in Israel, the 450 rockets.
And Jeremy
Corbyn, which we'll also get to later today, some articles that came out on that. But love to play this for you in here.
This is Adam Levick.
So good morning, everyone. We're really excited to have Adam Levick with us. He is the managing editor of UK Media Watch, which is a Camera affiliate. As some of you may recall, we had Sean Durns from Camera North America on with us a few weeks ago to talk about really what it is that Camera as well as UK Media Watch do in communicating with journalists, media news outlets related to articles or positions they may take that may have a skewed position, inaccurate reporting, and questions around really Israel. So it's a focus that ensures that there is truth in that reporting, and sometimes it does require some education. I do think having Adam today is very timely. Earlier this week, the European Court of Justice released an opinion that was based on a 2016 challenge from the Sadat Winery related to labeling and requiring the labeling of their product as being an Israeli settlement. And the European Court of Justice took a very strong position on it and actually called the settlements illegal. Now, that is terminology that is at question, obviously by the Israeli government, being that the only time Jews were not living in that territory were between 1948 and 1967 when it was under Jordanian rule. And so there's been an outcry by the American Jewish community. Over 50 major Jewish organizations have come out and criticized this as being very typical and common and echoing of the labeling by the Nazi government. And we've seen an outcry from the Jewish world as well as from Israel. So with that, I welcome you, Adam. Thank you for being with us today.
It's a pleasure to be on your show. Thank you.
Absolutely. So tell us what it is that UK Watch does, to the extent it's any different from Camera here in the U.S.
Okay, well, UK Media Watch, and we're part of Camera. We are simply the British brand of Camera, along with our sister site, BBC Watch. So, again, I work for Camera, and our sister site, BBC Watch, just focuses on monitoring the BBC, which, as you know, is an international, I think the largest international broadcaster in the world. And I focus on the rest of the British media, so I monitor The Guardian, The Independent, The Telegraph, The Times of London, The Daily Mail, and various other British media outlets. And we, so just like what Camera does, we hold them accountable to accuracy and getting the facts right. And we believe that, there's nothing political about the truth, that we just hold them accountable to the accuracy clause of the editor's code. And we just have a strategy that really focuses on corrections and to communicate directly with journalists and editors in an attempt to get them to know that A, their articles about Israel are being watched, and B, that we're holding them accountable. So that's what we do with the British media.
Now, one of the concerns, obviously, as the American diaspora, as we're looking at Europe, we see this rise in anti-Semitism, and I've seen plenty of articles coming out from the European community that has skewed or inaccurate reporting. I mean, we've seen it in the 2014 Operation Protective Edge. We've seen it in the Friday March of Return. Tell us what you're seeing in the UK and what you're covering as far as reporting that that is of concern that you think is inaccurate or, not telling the full truth?
Well, the most recent, big news story from Israel that the media covered was, of course, the recent rocket attacks from Gaza from Islamic Jihad. Israel was subjected to over 400 rocket attacks over the course of 3 days. Many schools, including the school or preschool that my daughters go to, were closed for one day. And we live in the middle of the country, and the schools were closed by the Gaza envelope communities for, I think, 3 or 4 days. And what we see in the British media coverage of the war are very typically failing to give context. For instance, failing to note that not only is Islamic Jihad a terrorist organization and prescribed as such by most of the Western democracies, but that they're even more radical than Hamas, if you can believe that, and that they have carried out terrorist attacks over the past decades that have killed scores of Israelis. And that also, we find just in the day-to-day reporting that they oftentimes, it almost seems like they try really hard to advance the narrative that Israel is indiscriminately, attacking Gaza and killing civilians, when of course the opposite is correct. There is no army in the world that goes to greater lengths to protect their enemy civilians. And there's lots of tactics they use. Go ahead. Sorry.
No. I wasn't. I thought you were done. But I guess one of the questions I had too. We're looking at the foreign. I think it's very difficult, by the way, for people here in the U.S. to appreciate what that's like. You're talking about a very small strip of land, Israel. It's a tiny little strip of land. And the terror that strikes the heart of children, elderly families, when within 3 days you have 450 rockets being launched into your territory completely randomly. No one knows where they're going to go, with only seconds to get to shelter. I found during Operation Effective Edge, it was similar, where there was reporting coming out of Europe that we saw, where it was only reporting on Israel's strikes into Gaza, where they were trying to strike down those rocket launchers, but it wasn't talking about what was really happening on the other end, as far as the rockets coming into Israel and the trauma being caused onto those Bedouin communities. So were you seeing response from the media outlets that you were having conversations with or dialogue with related to the reporting on what happened this week?
Well, it's still, it oftentimes takes a long time of process to get a false claim corrected. So we're in the process of communicating with the UK Independent to get them to correct a claim that suggested that most of those killed in Gaza by Israeli strikes were civilians, when in fact the opposite is true. We know for a fact, based on research that we've done, based on research that our Arabic researchers have done, and based on information put out by reliable sources, that the large majority of those killed in I guess, the 3-day conflict in Gaza were terrorists from Islamic Jihad. And that's a big, big point. I can't emphasize this enough because, if you were to base your opinion of what's happening in Israel and the Palestinian territory solely on how the British media reports, especially the Guardian and Independent, you really think that Israel not only isn't concerned about civilian life in Gaza and the Palestinian and the West Bank, but that they intentionally attack civilian targets. And this is one of those inversions that it's the opposite of the truth, and it's really frustrating for those of us who read it every day, and those of us who live here and know Israeli soldiers and have friends in the IDF. And we know for a fact that these are lies, but our job as professionals who work for camera to make the case to these media outlets using, facts and reliable sources and persuasion. So right now we're in the process of trying to get that claim corrected at the Independent.
And, I'm glad that you talked about who was being struck. I think a lot of people listening are not aware of the fact that Hamas and Islamic Jihad actually don't get along. Islamic Jihad is a small minority in Gaza, and they are considered an enemy of Hamas. And yes, as you mentioned, more extreme than Hamas. And that some of the reports I've seen is that there were over 60 of their own rockets that they were launching into Israel that either backfired or landed somewhere within Gaza, which in and of itself could have also caused injury to civilians within Gaza or to other terrorists within Gaza. You don't see the reporting there. I mean, I haven't seen it in the U.S. Have you seen any reporting of that there in the UK?
It's interesting. We saw some journalists talking about it on Twitter, but there was the big issue that we were following about that was there was a building in Gaza that was home to a human rights organization. I forget the name of the organization, but it was hit by a rocket. So immediately the NGO Amnesty International tweeted its condemnation of what it claimed was an Israeli, illegal Israeli strike on a reputable human rights the building that houses a human rights organization. Well, it turned out that journalists on the ground, even the Middle East correspondent from Fox News, for instance, contradicted that. He was right there and saw the rocket attack. And the claim by Amnesty, this large international, powerful NGO that has a huge budget, was tweeting to lots of their followers and being retweeted that it was an Israeli attack on a human rights organization in Gaza when that was the opposite of the truth. So, those things are really challenging because whenever there's even an accidental attack by the IDF or, an attack that goes wrong that inadvertently hits a civilian target, the media plays it for all it's worth, and NGOs like Amnesty International are just as guilty. But in this case, there was evidence from almost the second that the building was hit, based on the trajectory of the rocket, that the rocket came from terrorists by Islamic Jihad. So that was actually an example of where we were able to refute that quickly than we usually do. Usually it takes a lot of time, days, weeks, and months to get the story straight, to get evidence we need to refute the false claims from the media about attacks like that.
So, I mean, let me ask you, what do you do? I mean, I don't know if this is UK Media Watch or if this is another affiliated camera, but what do you do when an organization like Amnesty, for instance, puts out that claim that is false or misconstrues the truth? Who's actually having that dialogue with them, and do you find that dialogue is difficult? Are they responsive? Are they open to the evidence to say this actually is not what happened? It was a different story.
Okay, well, in the case of Amnesty and NGOs like that, there's an organization that I recommend your listeners go to their website. They do a really good job of holding NGOs accountable. They're called NGO Monitor. And they do have dialogues both on social media, on Twitter, and I'm sure by email and other ways of trying to hold them accountable when they demonize and vilify Israel and make false claims about Israel. However, I mean, while you should definitely talk to them if you want to know their success in dealing with these NGOs. In general, we find that media outlets are very defensive when they're accused of getting the facts wrong. And, they take their jobs seriously. They think that they're the disseminators of truth, and oftentimes they are. But when they get things wrong, we find that they kind of circle the wagons and they defend each other, and they really resist acknowledging when they get things wrong. So like I said, our job is to maintain professional, cordial relationships with their editors, their journalists, and try to get, even though they definitely don't like us necessarily, we usually have a cordial professional relationship. I think that's the key in what we do. And, oftentimes we have supporters that will tweet or send letters to outlets trying to get them to correct false claims. And we always advise them just to be civil, to be cordial, not to use inflammatory language, not to make ad hominem attacks on the individuals, not to accuse people of things that you don't know whether they did that or not, but just to stick to the facts, use sources, and just keep it civil. And we find that's the best way of being effective in what we do and holding media outlets accountable.
I guess, from my perspective, I'm looking at this and I think oftentimes the damage is already done, right? If the media is not willing to correct it right before it's ultimately released, and then you have thousands and thousands of tweets and retweets of it, the damage is already done. Nobody's going to go back to look for a correction 6 or 8 weeks later, and then correct their prior, tweets. And so, along that line, I think even with, like I mentioned at the beginning of the call, the ruling by the European Court of Justice this week, Do you find that in the UK, as well as throughout Europe, that there is a growing ideology or predisposition against Israel, a bias against Israel that is affecting the media?
Well, there's a relationship in this sense that media outlets typically will cite opinions or rulings or votes by international bodies like the UN or like the European Union or like the Court of Justice as if it's fact. And we just try to urge them, look, if you're going to give their ruling, then at least give equal space in the sense of fairness and professionalism to voices that don't agree with these international bodies. For instance, there's a international law expert by the name of Eugene Kontorovich, who is one of the foremost experts on international law, and he's just a great authority on why the EU ruling regarding labeling of products made in the territories are glaring example of a double standard against Israel. He makes the case, for instance, that this ruling didn't say that products made in Moroccan settlements should be labeled "made in Moroccan settlements," or that products made in Tibet should be called "made in occupied Tibet" or occupied Crimea. It's only Israel that is singled out. So a lot of us argue, and I think the IRA definition of working definition of anti-Semitism calls anti-Semitism amongst its many aspects. And you hold Israel to a double standard that no other country is held accountable to. So to answer your question, yes, these rulings by the EU and international bodies have huge impact on Israel's legitimacy around the world. But our job, we're concerned with media outlets at least giving the other side, to giving the Israeli side, to giving fair amount of space to voices that have very good knowledge of the subject and disagree with the EU or international bodies' opinion.
And do you find that these outlets are responsive to that? And for instance, on this example of this individual, this expert, and what he's talking about and pointing out these other issues in response to the EU ruling, have you found a willingness to consider those issues or give equal space?
Well, a few articles will just mention that Israel disputes the claim. Israel disputes the rationale behind the EU ruling. But very infrequently will they cite an expert to give a very detailed explanation about why it's incorrect. So we're working on that. But it's very hard because I think there's this groupthink amongst media outlets, especially in the UK. And when a ruling comes down from the UN or the EU, it's treated as if it's gospel. And so, but we've been making some progress, but it's definitely an uphill battle to get them to acknowledge that that there is another side. The other side has a very good argument, and that argument should be heard by their news consumers.
So let me switch topics. One of the and you may or may not deal with this at UK Media Watch, but one of the growing concerns of the Jewish diaspora here in the States is Jeremy Corbyn. And, we see, reports all the time and those who are constantly defending Jeremy Corbyn and saying he's not anti-Semitic, yet the Jewish world in the UK very openly is concerned about his anti-Semitism. Obviously, Tony Blair had a piece last week related to the rise of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, put out a very strong warning. Do you see the British media outlets covering that with a level of accuracy, or is there some level of whitewashing as to the level of anti-Semitism and pushback by your organization?
It's an interesting question because the media has actually been more careful about covering the Jeremy Corbyn Labour anti-Semitism crisis than they are issues that pertain specifically about Israel. I think they've they're not going to say, I wouldn't give them a good grade, but I think they're careful not to completely dismiss the claims of the overwhelming majority of Jews in the UK that the opposition leader who's running to become prime minister on December 12th is anti-Semitic, and that and they seem to have a hard time ignoring the fact that 87% of British Jews in recent polls believe that he's personally anti-Semitic. That 40% of British Jews have thought about emigrating out to other countries if he became prime minister. That the three major British newspapers, in an unprecedented joint editorial, characterized the threat to Jeremy Corbyn becoming prime minister as nothing less than an existential threat to British life in the UK. So, again, I'm not giving him a passing grade. There's still lots of room for improvement, but they've actually been more careful to not be openly defending Corbyn in at least their news articles and their official op-eds than other issues, than we would have expected. But this is, just to give you a sense, I was in London a couple of weeks ago. I gave a couple talks, and I met with the Jewish community leaders. And, the Jewish community there is literally on war footing. I mean, there's talk about anti-Semitism in America. It's just a serious issue. It's up. The numbers are up. But in the UK, this is seen as a true existential crisis. And the British Jews and British Jewish community leaders, they're bearing in for a fight like they never had before. And they really believe this is an existential threat to their future in the UK. And, I don't know to what degree the American media is covering it, probably obviously not as closely as the UK media. But if you want to look at, where anti-Semitism around the world is a problem, UK is ground zero in terms of the fear of what is, I believe, the third largest Jewish community in the world. I think there's something like 260,000 Jews in the UK. I think that leaves them behind France and the US as the largest Jewish diaspora community. So this is a serious issue. I think the media can improve, but it hasn't been as bad as we feared. I'll just say it like that.
Okay. Well, with that, we'll wrap up. But I appreciate that commentary. Obviously, it's something we are monitoring closely. I do wish the U.S. media would pay closer attention to it, as you mentioned. But certainly major Jewish organizations here in the U.S. are very attuned to what's happening there. We see, and it's almost this fear of this pile-on, right? You have the ruling from the European Court. You have, what's going on in England right now, in the UK. Obviously, the rise of anti-Semitism, which has been so blatant in Germany and France in recent years. So lots of reasons to be on alert. So we thank you for your time today. We thank you for what you're doing. Very important role in making sure that the truth is being put out there and that these individuals are being challenged. So thank you, Adam Levick, for your time.
It's been a pleasure doing your show. Thanks very much.
Absolutely. We hope to have you get back again soon.
Fascinating interview. But let me, one of the things he said is when they call out a journalist and say that you've done something wrong, they push back. And as a journalist, let me tell you, the target of every investigation I ever did, everyone would say you got it wrong. And sometimes they're right. In my case, fortunately, they weren't most times. And let me give you a real quick example. I was doing a story about hospice. They were under a criminal investigation by the state. Their attorney sat as close to me as you are, and he said, Mike, you are so crazy. You are so wrong. You have no idea. And then I handed him the email from Pam Bondi's office saying, we're turning down your public records request because there's a criminal investigation of hospice going on. But then let me say, if I ever made a mistake, I wanted to get on the air as quickly as possible and say, we got it wrong.
Well, I think you're dealing with a subset of people here. And what he's talking about, when he's talking about reporters at the Independent or organizations, that there is a pushback because they have a mindset, and they've already made up their mind about Israel. So
there is an agenda.
That preconceived exactly.
But not there are legitimate journalists that.
Of course, but that's not what he's talking about.
No, he talked about people getting facts from the UN and assuming that because you got it from the UN, it's right. But I'm just saying from the journalist standpoint, if I made a mistake, I wanted to correct it because I wanted to get the truth on the air.
But you look at the frustration that he's having right now with the Independent, and it was obviously wrong. It's going to be, and if you're waiting 6 to 8 weeks to correct something, the damage is already done. Nobody's going to go digging or even think about, it was wrong, let me go look for another report to see. That's the problem. And it's prolific in Europe. That is the problem. But a couple other quick things. There is a really good piece. I want to tee up next week, but just quickly make people aware. There's a really good piece in the Times of Israel this week on Jeremy Corbyn. It's in their magazine. It's titled "How Bad Would It Get?" Month before vote, UK Jews worry over a Corbyn government. And along those lines, there is actually an Orthodox Jew who's a social worker running against Corbyn in his district. I just think it's hilarious. I mean, I don't think he's going to win, but I would love for him to win just because it just would be, a classic, classic parody on that.
It's like Michael Bloomberg who announced that he's thinking of running. He said at one point when he decided not to run, he says, I don't think America is ready to elect a little Jewish man from Manhattan as president. But then, since Trump's been elected, all the rules are out. Who would have thought?
All things are possible. So, but we only have a couple of minutes left. I did want to tee up next week because I think this is so important. I know we talked about one of the complaints filed by the Jerusalem Institute of Justice in the International Criminal Court against Hamas and Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas. We're going to have Uri Murad on next week, who is the director of the JIJ in Jerusalem. And we're not only going to be talking about that, we're also going to be talking about the complaint they recently filed against Mahmoud Abbas for horrific crimes against humanity. Uri he has a testimony of over 52 Palestinians who were horrifically terrorized, tortured. They were tortured.
Yeah,
and some of them are now dead. They were tortured, and just sadly, if the government suspected them for a moment of being conciliatory at all to Israel, so just terrible situations of what was happening to men, women, and children. And the complaint, and his complaint cites, many sources as well from the Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, and other human rights organizations. And this goes to the point that we're always talking about, that, I love the Palestinian people, so I support BDS. And yet I never hear those people ever talking about these issues. I mean, you read this and it's
burning people with cigarettes.
It's beyond that. It's heart-wrenching. There's a letter, there's a notice of office of the prosecutor regarding the crimes against humanity, where they submit a chart of the testimonies of these people, these Palestinians who were tortured. And
it was accepted as fact by organizations that are not usually friendly to Israel.
Right. And these, by the way, these Palestinians were actually able to get justice in a Jewish court that awarded them monies against the Palestinian Authority. But, what do you do about the psychological and the physical damage? I mean, some of these people are living in constant pain, and it's just really sad. But this goes to my point of, if you really care about humanity and this is a human rights issue for you, please don't ignore the people that you supposedly, are standing up for. There's real atrocities being committed on the Palestinians by the Palestinian Authority, by Hamas in Gaza, by the Jordanian government, by the Palestinians in Lebanon. I mean, they're treated as third-class citizens there, and the Palestinians in various surrounding countries. So it's just I think it's a very important dialogue. I already talked with him once this week, and it's just I just want to stress that you don't want to miss next week.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. One other thing, or a couple of things, but one I want to definitely get in. Alexander Vindeman, the colonel, is going to testify this week. Do you know that he was a twin, and a photographer started capturing them from the time they were like 5 years old? There's also
and his twins. So there's like a whole book of it's really cool to follow the life story of these individuals of the twins. It was really cool.
So when you see him testify this week and before the committee, you think not only is this guy a war hero and an expert on Ukraine, he's also got a whole other life.
He's a male model.
Yeah,
he's a male model.
Right, and he's Jewish. I mean, for those who didn't know, he's Jewish. So I thought that was fascinating. In fact, I'd like to get some of the photos. I mean, there's a little.
I saw the article, but I didn't see any more of the photos. And also, so there's another positive story. So there's this really cool. I mean, Israel has such great innovation. They're always focusing on water technology. So there's an Israeli company that makes water out of thin air, literally. And it's called Water Gen, and literally it takes the humidity and it creates water. So in very dry arid lands where they don't have a lot of water, it's just a great resource for fresh drinking water. And so they just signed a huge deal with Uzbekistan. So very excited about that little Israeli company and a lot of the water ingenuity they're bringing to areas of the world that are water scarce. And I don't know if you all remember this in the Olympics, the Iranian judoka professional who, I think it was him, he couldn't shake the Israeli's hand. Well, he finally was able to get asylum. He's going to the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, and he was able to get asylum. And I think, because he rejected the policies of Iran, I just think that's such a very positive story about sports. And
I've got another sports story. We'll talk about it next week because we are out of time. This is The Third Opinion. I'm Mike Deason.
Laureen Jaffe, thank you.
See you next week at noon. Have a great day. Bye.
All right.
You're listening to WMNF Tampa. Today is November 17th, 2019, as we join Kulanu across the globe in honoring international Jewish communities. I'm Joy Katzen-Guthrie. Welcome to the Sunday Simcha.